Welcome everyone to the Floral Mile, Meet the Experts.
Good evening everyone. My name's Mark and I live in Chepstow, and I'm briefly going to talk about the what we might call the background to wildflower planting along the Greenway. And the first thing I want to point out is that the shrubs and trees that grow along the line now are mainly secondary woodland that has grown up since the railway has closed. None of it is ancient woodland. And this is a very interesting picture taken south of Tinton Station looking northwards in 1963. The Tinton Station is at the top right hand of the picture. The bridge over the River Wye in the foreground is now gone, but that embankment is still there. If you look at this satellite picture of the situation now, that big embankment is now covered in tall trees. Tinton Station, which is now a cafe, is at the top right of that picture. This just shows you how quickly trees, which we call secondary woodland, can grow up. And if we look again, look at that high embankment in 1963, completely clear of vegetation, because in the days of steam, embankments were kept scythed or mown short because of the danger of sparks from the steam trains causing line-side fires. So indeed, most of the Wye Valley Railway, where it had embankments or cuttings, would have had short grass. So what's happened to all the wildflowers? Well, until the mid-20th century, hedgerows, verges, meadows contained a diverse range of wildflowers. But nowadays, mainly because of nitrate pollution diffusing from agriculture and also pollution in the rain, favours very vigorous species such as nettles, hogweed, coarse grasses and brambles. And also roadside verges, which in the days of horse-drawn transport were always cut for hay by farmers or villages, are no longer cut for hay. So there's been quite a transformation, and we've lost a lot of those wildflowers that used to grow on our roadsides. And in 1920, an author called Shoolbred wrote the Flora of Chepstow, and it's really sobering to read it. There's many, many wildflowers mentioned in there as common, including loads of orchids in the Chepstow area, which you now rarely see at all or are extinct in this area. The Floral Mile project gives us a chance to restore some of the diversity of the local flora, and we have Shoolbred as a reference as to what is genuine. And so we can put the right plants in the right places. And as far as wildflowers are concerned, we can broadly classify the Floral Mile into 3 broad habitat types to help us put the right plants into the right places. This is an oversimplification, but it's a good way of looking at things. It gives us a framework. So first of all, we have grassland flowers. At the south end of the Greenway, there are big sunny areas of bare stony ground, ballast, which is what they call the rocks that the railway track was built on, and subsoil. These are suitable and the best sites to try and establish flowery grassland. Flowery grassland needs poor soil. It's difficult and slow to establish from seed and unpredictable, and critically, it has to be scythed or strimmed, and the clippings have to be removed to maintain low fertility. Here are some pictures I took this morning of flowery grassland beside High Beach Roundabout in Chepstow. This year, Monmouthshire Council has this policy of, so far, not cutting public grassland. And it's been a revelation there's several areas around Chepstow which we now realise are virtually wildflower meadows that were hiding in plain sight because they were constantly mowed and we didn't know they were there. This is one example. The best example is actually Conway Drive in Bulwark. If any of you wants to go and see typical flowery grassland and what we could aspire to on those embankments beside the Greenway, I recommend you go and walk up Conway Drive in Bulwark, the far end of Bulwark. Second habitat type, woodland flowers. They like different soil conditions. They like a rich, damp soil, and critically, they need sunlight. They flower and complete their life cycle early in the season before the deciduous trees are in leaf. And as it happens, there are also interesting ferns and geological features along the Greenway. Now, there was a traditional way of cutting young trees to the ground level called coppicing, which was a way of managing traditional woodland, and this supported woodland wildflowers. Unfortunately, coppicing is almost completely died out, leading to woodlands becoming overgrown and a degradation and loss of wildflower habitat, and also of woodland edge and woodland glades, which are important habitat for insects. One of the losses, a terrible loss, is the pearl-bordered fritillary, which used to be a common butterfly in hazel coppice and is now in this area classified as threatened because it's almost extinct. This is something, an insect we might be able to encourage along the Greenway by planting dog violets. This is an example of how it's not just flowers you encourage. If you put the right flowers in the right places and manage them properly, you can support other kinds of wildlife. So what about ivy? A lot of vigorous ivy along the Greenway. Well, when it grows up trees into its so-called arborescent form, it flowers, and then it's a useful source of nectar and pollen for late-flying insects, such as this interesting ivy mining bee in that little insect photograph. But when it's growing across the ground, it can be very invasive and it smothers the woodland flowers, and it needs to be controlled. Of course, in previous centuries, it would have been controlled by grazing animals, such as deer or cattle in woodland and coppices, which love ivy, but there's no grazing animals along the Greenway. So we will have to remove invasive ivy across the ground to make space for a greater diversity of flowers. A third type of habitat type is what we might call ruderal ground, which means disturbed ground. And there's a nice ruderal area along the Greenway in front of these containers. Typically, this kind of ground encourages or has tall, fast-growing flowers such as teasels, evening primrose, viper's bugloss, various kinds of thistles, and hemp agrimony, which indeed many of those things are there already. We can plant more of them. Here they are. And these flowers are wonderful forage for moths. And of course, moths are food for bats. So if we have an area which we could call our moth garden or moth strip, where we plant those tall ruderal flowers, we may be helping to support our lesser horseshoe bats that live in the tunnel. And with that, I finish my short talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mark. So handing over to Liz from EcoHab Wildflowers to explain what EcoHab Wildflowers do and how to go about seed collection and propagation. Liz.
So hello to everyone. EcoHab Wildflowers is based in West Gloucestershire, just outside of Churcham. It's a new company. I only set it up last year during the first lockdown. It was a good lockdown project. So we're quite unique as a nursery because we specialise in local provenance plants to the areas of Gloucestershire and Herefordshire, which means that I pretty much collect all of my own seed for the production. So I'm very, very keen on seed collection and seeds in general. So I'd like to try and infuse you on this subject in this brief talk today. So the subjects that I'm going to cover in this seed collecting talk is will hopefully equip you with the tools to be able to go out and do your own seed collecting, which you can then spread in areas on the floral mile that Mark was talking about in the 3 different habitat types, and maybe even raise some of your own plugs. So I'm going to talk briefly about seed morphology, and then about the law relating to collecting wildflower seed, how to tell whether seeds are ripe, and then looking specifically at bluebell seed collection, which are quite ripe, coming into ripeness in the next few weeks. So, so seeds are incredibly variable, but they generally are composed of 3 different components. So you have the embryo and the seed storage organ, which is normally stored in something called an endosperm or the cotyledons, and then the protective seed coat. Now I've got some pictures here that are very, very close up and have been dyed for impact, but it's from a book by an amazing guy that works at the Millennium Seed Bank, and he's basically photographed seeds up close to show the amazing structural adaptations and fascinating structures that seeds have. So you might not be aware, but common spotted orchid seed are dust-like, and they're called balloon seeds because they move around in the air and they're dispersed in the wind, so they have to be very, very lightweight. So they don't actually contain an endosperm, which is why mycorrhizal fungi is so important to common spotted orchid. We also have red campion seed on the bottom left. They have an interesting dispersal in that they hold their seeds in a cup, and when the wind sways, the seeds get sort of blown out of the cup. They have an interesting sort of intricate pattern on the surface of the seed. Cornflower is one of the seeds that is dispersed by ants. So the structure you can see at the base of the seed is called an oil body or an elastome, and that attracts ants and helps them to spread the seed in the environment. Now, when you're out collecting, I think it's important to have a good understanding of the legislation that covers wildflowers. So, contrary to popular belief, it is not illegal to pick wildflowers or to collect wildflower seed or parts of the plant. It's essentially protecting our ancient foraging rights. What is illegal, though, and is protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act is the prevention of uprooting any plant. You can only do that with landowner permission. So if we go through the do's first, the positives, make sure you always collect seed from a plant population that you've identified correctly. There's a few things that can catch you out, even with perhaps some of the very common wildflowers that you might be familiar with, like bluebells that have non-native Spanish forms and the hybrids. Yellow archangel also has a garden variegated form that you need to look out for. So just be very aware of the plant population that you're collecting from and that you've identified it correctly when it's in flower, so that when you go back to collect the seeds, you know what you're collecting and don't get any surprises. always collect in breathable bags, something like paper or a mesh, plastic mesh bag. Seeds are living things and they don't like to be sealed up in plastic. Make sure you always collect from wild places and not gardens, because they can contain often sort of quite similar but cultivated forms of our wildflowers, and we don't want to be planting those on the floral mile. Whenever you collect seed, collect it sustainably. What I mean by that is don't collect the whole ripe population that's in an area. Only collect, as a general guide, about 20% of the seed are ripe at that time, and never collect from a rare plant population. Stick to footpaths and common land unless you have landowner permission to go off the footpaths and collect. It is illegal, and you can't collect seed in protected areas such as triple SIs and nature reserves without getting the relevant permissions from the statutory bodies like Natural England or the Wildlife Trusts or whoever owns the reserve. Don't collect seed of rare species. You'll need a license to do that, a Schedule 8 license, and lots of experience. Don't disturb other flora and fauna whilst you're seed collecting. Don't trample the sort of existing population there. And definitely don't root up any plants or bulbs without landowner permission, because then you will be getting into the realms of breaching a Wildlife and Countryside Act. But other than that, you know, you can go along footpaths and collect seeds to your heart's content, or work with a local landowner and collect seed, and it's all good. It's an exciting thing to do, and it's important to try and increase the populations of these wildflowers, so it will all help. So when you are collecting seed, there's some important things to look out for. I'd say there's probably 4 key points for to assess the ripeness of your seed and when to collect it. Now, a lot of seeds are held in capsules, quite fleshy capsules, and when these start to change colour from green, going often to a yellowy colour and then straw-like, when you're getting towards the yellow and straw-like colour, the capsule will start to split open, and that's when it's going to naturally disperse. Now, you'll want to obviously collect it before natural dispersion, so you might want to collect the seed just before it's fully ripe to avoid losing that seed. If you look at the wild daffodil picture, I'd say you'd want to be aiming for a capsule that's sort of in the middle, or the one second from the left, to avoid losing that seed. Wild daffodil also has a habit of the stems just flop to the ground, so they're not held upright, so it's quite easy to lose that seed. The other thing to look out for with assessing seed ripeness, if you look at the greater stitchwork picture, you can see that when the seeds are unripe, they're a white colour, and those you can probably press those and some milkiness will be exuded from the seed. Whereas when they're ripe, they go this orange colour and they're much more firm and you can't press them down. Another seed that you might want to focus on collecting that Mark also mentioned, common dog violet. It does have a habit of splitting open as soon as the weather gets warm, especially if they're growing out in the open. So obviously the capsule on the right, you've lost the seed there, so that's too ripe. It's unlikely you'll find many capsules that are open like that are fully mature. that's quite hard to find, but that's the ideal sort of mature seeds you want to be aiming for. But to avoid not losing the seed, I would say you could also collect capsules that are sort of going paler green, like the two here. You can also collect the very green ones here, but they don't always ripen off the plant. So it's 50-50 whether those will actually turn into viable seed or not. It's better to go for the more mature ones. Yeah, so those are the sort of things to look out for when you're seed collecting, so you avoid collecting immature seed or losing the seed altogether. So collecting bluebell seed, Keith mentioned that this was probably a species that the Floral Mile volunteers might want to focus seed collection. So I've gone into a little bit more detail. Always start by assessing the bluebell population. So make sure that you've got your native bluebells and not your Spanish or your hybrid bluebells. And there's some tips to look out for on the left of ID characteristics. If you are going to be collecting off the footpaths, then make sure you seek landowner permission. Always take out breathable bags to collect the bluebells in, and some scissors. You'll need the scissors to cut off the stem at the base, which will be holding multiple capsules. And as you're collecting, keep those stems upright. So, because when bluebell seeds are ripe, they tend to, the capsules will open up, but they'll hold the seeds within those capsules. So you can collect them when they're fully ripe, but just make sure that you hold them upright so the seeds don't fall out. And then a top tip to get any remaining seeds out of the capsules is to vigorously jiggle the seeds round in a bag, probably a plastic bag, just temporarily, and seal the top. And that sort of effectively threshes the seed out of the capsule, and then you'll end up with pure seed at the bottom, and it's quite easy just to lift off those capsules. Bluebell seed likes to be sown quite deeply in late summer to autumn. Obviously you won't get a flowering plant for 3 years, but they do establish very well from seed, and at least you can ensure local provenance and to be able to sow large areas by going down the seed sowing route. So other seed that you might be able to collect at the moment going into June, we've talked about bluebell, wild daffodil. I'd say that's towards the end of its seed collecting season at the minute. I collected quite a lot of daffodil seed today. I'd say probably 80% of it had gone over, but there were still quite a few capsules around, so it's worth having a look for that. Make sure that you've assessed the population, that it's wild and not the cultivated daffodil. Ways to tell are much thinner, sort of glaucous grey-green leaves, and the seed capsule is generally a lot smaller. Greater stitchwort, that's probably about a week off being ripe at the moment. It's quite easy to collect little circular capsules with the orange seeds that I showed you in a previous slide. Red campion will probably be ready in 2 to 3 weeks. It's a great one to collect. Very, very easy because it holds the seed in a cup, nice and ready for you to just come along and pluck it off the plant. Bush vetch, it's a lovely ancient woodland indicator of hedgerows. It does occur around the Floral Mile. That's got a typical pea pod. It will split open, so it's good to keep an eye on it. That picture of the pod was taken today, so I think probably it will be about 2 weeks before those are mature. And yellow archange was another one we've been planting on the floral mile. It doesn't produce fertile seeds, so you'd have to do that from cuttings, but it does root quite readily through cuttings, and it's also stoloniferous. And then sweet violet common and early dog violet are all good to collect at the moment. Again, keep an eye out for those changes in seed pod colour, and because it's a long flowering species, all of them sort of flower between kind of March to May. There'll be quite a lot of capsules developing all the time, so it's one that you can generally go out and always find some ripe capsules from sort of April onwards. Okay, so obviously after you've harvested your seed, you want to get it out of the bags quickly, lay it out on some newspaper or a tray in a thin layer, in a dry place in your house, out of direct sunlight, and let that dry off for about 2 weeks. You can then put it back into a bag for storage. I'd still recommend using a breathable bag, because unless you've dried your seed in a very dry environment and not in ambient temperatures, it will still be metabolically active, so you don't want to seal it in plastic. Cleaning the chaff and the stalks from your seed can be done through a series of sieves, or you could have a go at winnowing using your breath. That's quite fun, or using the wind to blow off the chaff. I use something called a zigzag aspirator, which has got a hoover attached to it. It's the lower picture there, and basically it separates the chaff from the seed by a weight differential, and the good seed sort of slips down the zigzag on the left, and the chaff gets sucked out by the suction of the hoover on the right, and ends up in a compartment on the right. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take anything on the chat, and good luck with your seed harvesting. I hope to speak to you more about how you've got on, and yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic, Liz. Thank you very much for that, and thank you, Mark, as well for your presentation.